It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday. The Tonight Show orchestra was warming up. Ed McMahon was reviewing his notes. The audience was filing in, buzzing with that particular energy that only comes from watching live television. Johnny Carson stood backstage in his dressing room, adjusting his tie in the mirror, running through his monologue one last time. February 18th, 1982. Just another show. Number 3000-something. He'd stopped counting years ago. But when Johnny walked out onto that stage at 5:30 p.m., looked into the hot lights, and began his opening jokes about Reagan's new budget proposal, he had no idea that in exactly 12 minutes, his entire show would come to a halt. He had no idea that sitting in seat 4C of the front row was a woman he hadn't seen in 23 years, a woman he'd once promised forever to, a woman whose name he'd trained himself not to think about. Jody Wolcott Carson, his first wife, the one from before. The monologue was going well. Johnny hit his marks. The audience laughed in all the right places. He made a joke about inflation, another about his golf game. Ed chimed in with perfect timing. Everything was smooth, mechanical, professional. This was what Johnny did. This was who he was, the man who never missed a beat. But then, mid-sentence, as he turned to gesture toward Ed, his eyes swept across the front row, and he saw her. For a split second, Johnny Carson, the most unflappable man in American television, forgot where he was. His mouth was still moving, but no sound came out. His hand froze in midair. The smile on his face flickered like a light bulb about to die. The audience didn't notice at first. They were still riding the wave of the previous joke. But Ed noticed. The director noticed. And up in the control booth, Fred de Cordova leaned forward, squinting at the monitor. Johnny blinked, recovered, forced the smile back into place. He finished the sentence, but it came out flat. Wrong. He glanced down at his cards, but the words blurred. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He could feel sweat forming at his hairline. In seat 4C, Jody sat perfectly still. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She was just watching him. Her hands were folded in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, touched with gray. She looked older, but then again, so did he. Johnny pushed through two more jokes. The audience laughed, but he barely heard them. His entire field of vision had narrowed to that one face in the crowd, the face he used to wake up next to, the face he'd seen across the kitchen table in a tiny apartment in Los Angeles when he was nobody, when he was just a kid from Nebraska trying to make it, when the only thing that mattered was getting her to laugh. He wrapped the monologue early, cut it short by a full minute. The audience didn't know. They applauded. Johnny walked over to his desk, sat down, and realized his hands were trembling. Ed was giving him a look, a what's going on look. Johnny ignored it. He shuffled his notes, took a sip of water. The camera was on him, millions of people watching. He was supposed to introduce the first guest. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched. 3 seconds. 5. An eternity in live television. Then Johnny turned to the audience and said something he'd never said before in 30 years of performing. "I need to take a break." The audience laughed nervously. They thought it was a bit. Johnny stood up. "No, I mean it. We need to stop for a moment." The laughter died. Confusion rippled through the studio. Ed stood up, concern flooding his face. The director's voice crackled in Johnny's earpiece. "Johnny, we're live. What are you doing?" Johnny pulled the earpiece out and dropped it on the desk. He stepped off the stage. The audience was dead silent now. Cameras were still rolling. Johnny walked down the 3 steps into the studio audience, his eyes locked on seat 4C. People turned in their chairs, trying to figure out what was happening. A few recognized her. Most didn't. Johnny stopped at the end of her row. "Jody," he said quietly. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them he couldn't name. Not anger, not sadness. Something older than both. "Hi, Johnny," she said. His voice came out hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I bought a ticket," she said simply. Behind him, the studio was chaos. Producers were shouting into headsets. The audience was murmuring. Ed was frozen at the desk, completely lost. But Johnny didn't care. For the first time in decades, he didn't care about the show. "Can we talk?" he asked. Jody nodded. Johnny turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take an unscheduled break. I apologize. Please bear with us." And then Johnny Carson, in front of 200 people and a live television audience of 15 million, sat down in the empty seat next to his first wife and said, "I didn't know if you were still alive." They'd met in 1948, Lincoln, Nebraska. Johnny was 22, working at a local radio station for $35 a week, doing magic shows on the side to make rent. Jody was 19, studying at the university, beautiful in that wholesome Midwestern way that made Johnny's heart stop every time she walked past the radio station window. He'd worked up the courage to talk to her at a campus party, made her laugh with a card trick, asked her to coffee. She said yes. 3 months later, he asked her to marry him in the front seat of a borrowed Chevrolet. She said yes to that too. They were married in October of 1949. Johnny was making $45 a week by then. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a Murphy bed and a hot plate. Jody worked as a secretary. Johnny worked every job he could find: radio announcer, staff writer, commercial voiceover artist. They were broke and happy and stupid with hope. Jody believed in him when nobody else did. When he got rejected from audition after audition, when other comedians told him he was too stiff, too Midwestern, too clean-cut, Jody would sit on the edge of their Murphy bed and say, "They don't know what they're talking about. You're going to make it." And he did. It took years. It took moving to California. It took 1,000 small humiliations and failures and near misses. But slowly, impossibly, Johnny Carson started to climb. Local TV, game show host, network attention. And then in 1962, the call came. The Tonight Show wanted him. By then, they had 3 sons: Christopher, Corey, and Richard. By then, they'd moved 5 times. By then, Johnny was drinking more, sleeping less, obsessing over every joke, every rating, every review. By then, Jody had started to feel like a piece of furniture in her own life. The success Johnny had dreamed of became the thing that destroyed them. He was never home. When he was home, he wasn't really there. His mind was always on the next show, the next bit, the next way to stay ahead. Jody tried to talk to him, tried to pull him back, but Johnny had tasted something he couldn't let go of: the roar of an audience, the validation of strangers, the high of making millions of people laugh. He didn't know how to be a person anymore. He only knew how to be a performer. The fight started, quiet at first, then louder. Jody accused him of choosing fame over family. Johnny accused her of not understanding the pressure he was under. Both of them were right. Both of them were wrong. In 1963, less than a year after Johnny took over The Tonight Show, Jody filed for divorce. Johnny didn't fight it. He was too proud, too angry, too convinced that she was the one who didn't understand. He signed the papers, paid the settlement, took the kids every other weekend, and pretended everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. For 23 years, it wasn't fine. Johnny remarried, twice. Both marriages ended the same way. He threw himself deeper into work, deeper into the character of Johnny Carson, until the man he used to be was buried so far down he couldn't find him anymore. And Jody, she disappeared, moved out of Los Angeles, remarried, raised the boys as best she could, watched Johnny on television sometimes late at night, and wondered if he ever thought about her. He did. He thought about her every single day. They sat in those seats for a full 2 minutes before either of them spoke again. Around them, the audience was still murmuring, unsure if this was part of the show. A few people were taking pictures. Most were just staring. Johnny finally broke the silence. "Why now?" Jody folded her hands tighter in her lap. "Because I'm getting older. Because I didn't want to die without saying something." "What do you need to say?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. "That I forgive you." Johnny felt something crack open in his chest. "Jody, let me finish," she said gently. "I forgive you for choosing the show over us, for disappearing into it, for becoming someone I didn't recognize." She paused. "But I also need to say I'm sorry." Johnny blinked. "For what?" "For expecting you to stay the same. For wanting you to be the boy I married when you were becoming something else. For not understanding that you needed this." She gestured toward the stage. "I was angry for a long time. I thought you'd abandoned us. But the truth is, I think you were just trying to survive." Johnny's throat was tight. "I did abandon you. I did choose this over you. I know. I was a terrible husband, a worse father. I know that too." He looked down at his hands. "Then why are you here?" Jody's voice was soft but steady. Because I don't want you to carry it alone anymore. I've watched you, Johnny, all these years. I've seen you on this stage making everyone laugh, and I can see it in your eyes. You're still punishing yourself." Johnny shook his head. "I deserve to be punished." "Maybe," Jody said, "but not by yourself, not forever." There was a long silence. Someone in the audience coughed. A camera was still rolling. Johnny could feel the weight of every eye in the room. "I've thought about calling you 1,000 times," he said quietly. "I never knew what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jody replied. "I just needed you to know that I don't hate you. I never did." Johnny felt his eyes burning. He hadn't cried in public since he was a child. He wasn't going to start now, but God, he wanted to. "The boys," he managed. "Are they okay?" Jody nodded. "They're good. They have their own lives, their own families. They don't talk about you much, but they don't hate you either. They just wish they'd known you better." That hurt more than anything. "I wish I'd known them better too." Jody reached over and placed her hand on top of his. Her skin was warm, familiar. "It's not too late, Johnny." He looked at her hand on his. "I don't know how to be a father. I never learned." "Neither did you know how to be a talk show host," she said. "But you figured that out." Despite everything, Johnny almost smiled. That was different. Was it? He didn't have an answer for that. Around them, the studio had gone completely silent. The audience wasn't murmuring anymore. They were just listening, watching, bearing witness to something they didn't fully understand but could feel was important. Johnny finally looked up at Jody. "I'm sorry, for all of it." "I know," she said. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not," she said, "but I'm giving it to you anyway." Johnny felt something inside him break. Not in a bad way. In the way a dam breaks. In the way a wound finally opens so it can heal. He stood up. Jody stood up with him. And then, in front of 200 strangers and 15 million viewers, Johnny Carson hugged his first wife for the first time in 23 years. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't make a sound. They just watched as two people who used to love each other stood in the middle of a television studio and held on like they were the only two people in the world. When they finally pulled apart, Johnny's eyes were red. Jody's were too. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded. "Take care of yourself, Johnny." "You too." Jody picked up her purse and walked toward the exit. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Johnny stood there for a long moment, watching her go. Then he turned back to the stage, climbed the steps, and sat down at his desk. Ed was still standing there, looking like he'd just watched a car accident. The crew was frozen. The audience was holding its breath. Johnny looked into the camera. His voice was rough, unsteady, but it was his. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I apologize for the interruption. That was my first wife. I hadn't seen her in a very long time, and I needed to talk to her." He paused. "Sometimes life happens in the middle of a show. I hope you understand." The audience began to applaud. Softly at first, then louder. Not the wild applause of a great joke or a celebrity entrance. Something quieter. Something that sounded like respect. Johnny cleared his throat. "We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll have our first guest. Please stay with us." The camera cut away. The moment the red light went off, Johnny put his head in his hands. Ed walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, Johnny?" Johnny didn't answer right away. When he finally looked up, his face was wet. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." The show didn't air that night. Fred de Cordova made the call. They replaced it with a rerun. Officially, they cited technical difficulties. Unofficially, everyone involved knew the truth. What had happened was too raw, too real, too private to broadcast. But the story got out anyway. A few audience members talked to reporters. Word spread through Hollywood. By the next morning, every newspaper in the country was running some version of the same headline. "Carson stops show to talk to ex-wife." Johnny didn't read the articles. He didn't do interviews about it. He didn't address it on the show. He just went back to work the next night and did his monologue like nothing had happened. But something had changed. People who worked with Johnny noticed it first. He was quieter, more present. He started leaving the studio earlier. He made a few phone calls he'd been putting off for years. He reached out to his sons, not with grand gestures or apologies, just small things. A call on a birthday, a letter, an invitation to lunch. It didn't fix everything. Some damage can't be undone. But it was a start. Jody never came back to the show. She didn't need to. She'd said what she came to say. But 6 months later, Johnny received a letter. It was postmarked from Northern California. Inside was a single photograph: Jody, her new husband, and Johnny's 3 sons at a family barbecue. Everyone was smiling. On the back, in Jody's handwriting, were 4 words: "They're doing just fine." Johnny kept that photograph in his dressing room for the rest of his career. He never showed it to anyone, never talked about it. But sometimes, between segments, when the audience was laughing and the cameras were off, he'd take it out and look at it, and he'd remember what it felt like to be forgiven. Years later, long after Johnny retired, long after he'd disappeared into his quiet life in Malibu, a reporter managed to track him down for an interview. It was one of the last he ever gave. Near the end of the conversation, the reporter asked, "What was the most important moment of your career?" Johnny thought for a long time. The reporter expected him to say the first Tonight Show, or the night he had Frank Sinatra and Bette Midler on his final episode, or one of the hundreds of iconic moments that defined American television. Instead, Johnny said, "There was a night in 1982. I stopped the show. I don't talk about it much." "Why was it important?" the reporter asked. Johnny looked out at the ocean. "Because it was the first time I chose to be a person instead of a performer." "Do you regret it?" Johnny smiled. A real smile. Not the one he used on camera. "No, I regret that it took me so long." The thing about being Johnny Carson was that everyone thought they knew him. They knew the smile, the timing, the perfectly calibrated persona. They knew the man who made them laugh every night for 30 years. But that man was a construction, a mask, a role he played so well he almost forgot it wasn't real. But underneath the mask was a kid from Nebraska who'd wanted to make people happy, who'd married a girl he loved, who'd chosen ambition over everything else and spent the rest of his life trying to figure out if it was worth it. The night Jody walked into that studio, Johnny was forced to confront the man he'd been running from for decades. And for the first time, he didn't run. He sat down, he listened, he let himself be seen. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just for Johnny, for everyone watching, because they realized that the man who seemed untouchable, who seemed to have it all, was just as lost and broken and human as the rest of us. That's the thing about vulnerability. It's terrifying, it's humiliating, it exposes every crack, every failure, every regret, but it's also the only thing that's real. Johnny spent his whole life being perfect on camera. But the moment people remember, the moment that mattered, was the one where he fell apart. In the years after Johnny retired, he became a ghost. He didn't do interviews, didn't make appearances, didn't chase the spotlight. He played tennis, he sailed, he watched the sunset from his deck in Malibu, he answered letters from fans in his own handwriting. And sometimes late at night, he'd think about Jody. He'd think about the apartment in Nebraska, the Murphy bed, the way she used to laugh at his terrible magic tricks, the way she used to believe in him when he didn't believe in himself. He'd think about the moment she walked into that studio, the courage it must have taken, the grace, and he'd think about what she said, "It's not too late." She was right. Johnny started calling his sons more often, started showing up to birthdays, to graduations, to weddings. He wasn't a great father. He'd missed too much. But he tried, and trying mattered. He reconciled with Jody, not as a husband, but as a friend. They exchanged letters, talked on the phone once in a while. There was no romance left, just respect. Just 2 people who'd survived each other and come out the other side. And in those final years, when Johnny's health started to fail, when the emphysema made it hard to breathe and the world started to close in, Jody sent him one last letter. It said, "You did good, Johnny. You made people happy. That counts for something." Johnny read that letter 100 times. He kept it on his nightstand. When he died in 2005, his sons found it there, folded and worn, like he'd been carrying it with him. The truth is, we all carry ghosts. We all have people we hurt, people we loved and lost, moments we wish we could take back, words we should have said, words we shouldn't have. Johnny Carson carried his ghosts for decades. He buried them under jokes and performances and the carefully constructed armor of fame. But ghosts don't stay buried. They find a way to surface. The night Jody walked into that studio, Johnny's ghost finally caught up with him. and instead of running, he turned around and faced them. That's the real story. Not the monologues, not the ratings, not the 30 years of perfect performances. The real story is what happened when the mask slipped, when the show stopped, when Johnny Carson, the untouchable king of late-night television, became human again. Because that's the moment we all recognize. That's the moment we've all lived. The moment when you realize you can't run anymore, when you have to stop and face the person you've been avoiding. When you have to choose between the life you've built and the truth you've been hiding from. Johnny chose the truth. And it didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the pain or the regret or the years of damage, but it gave him something he'd been missing for a long time. It gave him peace. If you go back and watch old episodes of The Tonight Show, you'll see Johnny at his best. The quick wit, the perfect timing, the way he could make anyone feel comfortable. The way he could turn a bad joke into gold with just a look. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll see something else. You'll see the distance in his eyes, the careful control, the sense that he's holding something back. That was the cost of perfection. That was the price of being Johnny Carson. But after that night in 1982, something changed. The distance was still there, but it was softer. The control was still there, but it didn't feel as rigid. Johnny started letting himself be a little more human, a little more vulnerable. Not often, not in big ways, but enough. Enough that the people who loved him could see it. Enough that he could see it himself. The last time Johnny's son saw him, he was sitting on his deck in Malibu, watching the sun go down. He was thin, tired. The emphysema had taken most of his strength. But his mind was still sharp. They talked about small things, the weather, tennis, old memories. And then as the sun dipped below the horizon, Johnny said something his sons had never heard him say before. He said, "I'm proud of you, all of you." His sons didn't know what to say. They'd waited their whole lives to hear those words. Johnny looked out at the ocean. "I wasn't a good father, I know that. But you turned out good anyway. That's because of your mother." "And you," one of them said. Johnny shook his head. "No, not me. I wasn't there." "You're here now," another said. Johnny was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I'm here now." That was the last real conversation they had. A few months later, Johnny Carson died peacefully in his sleep. He was 79 years old. The tributes poured in. Presidents, comedians, actors, musicians. Everyone had a story about Johnny, about how he'd given them their first break, about how he'd made them laugh, about how he'd shaped American culture in ways that couldn't be measured. But the tribute that mattered most came from a quiet woman in Northern California who didn't give interviews or make public statements. Jody Wolcott heard the news and sat down at her kitchen table and cried. Not for the man on television, not for the legend, for the boy she'd married in Nebraska, the one who'd done magic tricks and made her laugh and promised her the world, the one who'd gotten lost along the way, the one who'd finally found his way back. Here's what they don't tell you about fame. It's a trade. You give up pieces of yourself in exchange for something bigger. Applause, recognition, immortality. And for a while it feels worth it. It feels like you've won. But eventually you realize what you've lost, and by then it's too late to get it back. Johnny Carson made that trade. He gave up his marriage, his family, his private self. He became an icon, a legend, a name that will live forever. But the moments he treasured most, the ones he thought about at the end, weren't the ones in front of the camera. They were the ones in seat 4C. The ones where he stopped running. The ones where he let himself be forgiven. If you learned something from this story, if it made you think about the people you've lost or the words you've left unsaid, do me a favor. Don't wait 23 years. Don't let pride or fear or the weight of the past keep you from saying what needs to be said. Life is shorter than you think, and the people who matter won't be here forever. So stop the show, sit down, and say it before it's too late. Because in the end, that's the only thing that matters. Not the applause, not the success, not the carefully constructed image of who you're supposed to be. Just the truth, just the people you love, just the courage to be human. That's the lesson Johnny Carson learned, and it's the one he'd want you to remember.